What's up, y'all? This is Joe with the New Jersey Center for Global Equity. In just a minute, I'll be sharing a very cool conversation I had with an anti-war activist from the 70s. Given the most recent developments in the Palestinian genocide, I found it very important to try to figure out what the best way is for us to play our role in ending it right here in the United States, I guess specifically in New Jersey. What power do we have in stopping our government's complicity in genocide? And so I found myself drawing a lot of lessons from the anti-war actions of the Vietnam era. I see a lot of correlations, right? Whether it's the influence of the media, the Vietnam War was very televised. And now, like today, we are seeing this genocide play on our phones. It's, the videos come daily, and the lies that our government tells us regarding both of these events. So naturally, my research gravitated towards learning about the Catholic left and their actions. Seeing all these priests, nuns, and their friends break into draft offices, right, to steal at the A1 draft cards, which would be the next in line to get drafted to the Vietnam War, to see them break into FBI offices, and, that being one of the reasons that we discovered the illegal surveillance of the FBI on groups like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, AIM, and other groups. Originally, I was trying to put together a video essay drawing lessons from that past to apply to today. And in doing the research for it, I came across one of Ted's articles on his website. And I thought, I'd reach out to this guy. He seems to know quite a bit, and maybe he could actually help me find out about this one individual from the Catholic left that did settle in New Jersey. And turns out he was actually a participant in a lot of these actions. And, reaching out to him, trying to, ask him if he'd be willing to talk with me about it, provide me a little info, possibly do an interview. And I was thinking just like a couple of minutes, right? But lucky me, he actually has written a whole book about it. So without further ado, here I am with Ted Glick on his book, Burglar for Peace: Lessons Learned in the Catholic Left's Resistance to the Vietnam War, as we try to really work through those lessons to apply to what we are trying to do today.
I knew about the Vietnam War growing up as a kid and as a teenager. It started, I guess, the war really began as far as U.S. involvement in it in the early 60s under John Kennedy, so I was maybe 12 when that began to happen. And it just kept escalating and escalating. And I went to college in the fall of 1967. At the time, I pretty much was kind of neutral about the war. The government was saying we were there fighting communism. And the ideology that I had absorbed was that communism is evil. So I tended to say, well, I guess this is a war to free the Vietnamese people. But once I got to college, I began to look into it, especially when I needed to register for the Selective Service System, register for the draft in October of that year of 1967. That's when I turned 18. And that made me start to think much more about the war, because here I was in the queue. I theoretically could be called up, could go to Vietnam. I started reading about it. I had started talking to people at the college where I was going in Iowa, Grinnell College, where there were actually growing numbers of peers who were against it. And I pretty quickly came to realize my assumptions about what was going on were wrong, that it all along had been a case of the United States trying to replace French colonialism, right? The Vietnamese, after the end of World War II, successfully for a period, declared their independence from France, which had been a colonial power there since the late 1800s. And then there's an 8-year war of independence on the part of the Vietnamese against the French. The U.S. ended up starting to get involved with Vietnam after there was an agreement to end that French colonial control of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, actually Indochina, all three of those countries. So when I registered for the draft, the war had reached this phase where there were literally hundreds of people dying every day and the TV news was covering it. You had TV reporters embedded with U.S. troops. I remember, Walter Cronkite. There would be videos of what it was like. People were able to see what war really is like, see people being killed almost live. And so it had its impacts. I ended up deciding to leave college, join the anti-war movement, as well as the movement for black freedom, the civil rights movement that became a black freedom movement. So I did that after 2 years, and I moved back to the town where I had grown up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, started a local peace center. But the war just kept grinding on. This is now like the fall of 1969. And I had learned about this thing called the Catholic left. I wasn't a Catholic. I was taken to church as a kid, but I wasn't Catholic. But what really attracted me about this group was that they were going beyond draft resistance, which I had done. Right, I had actually eventually burned a second draft card that they sent to me, and then I actually burned an induction notice that they sent to me a few months later, telling me I had to report to go into the Army, and I refused to do that and burned my induction notice. This was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So I felt the need to do more because the war was just so terrible. It's a lot like Palestine. It's a lot like what's happening in Gaza right now. Like every day, it's like, it's just wrenching in terms of emotionally to know that your country, your government is doing this to these people who just basically want their freedom. They want their independence. So I was able to connect with the Catholic left, and that led to me eventually going to prison, etc.
Yeah, so let's highlight some of those events that you talk about in the book, starting with, I think the first action you took part of, or at least, I guess, how would I phrase it? Like that, because I don't want to say most important or the first, but it was definitely one that was of considerable note in your book, is the first of the February 1970 East Coast Conspiracy to Save Lives action.
Right.
Which, under the leadership of John Grady, you and others observed and took notes on the happenings at the North Philadelphia building that housed the draft board office. The group entered the building at 3 a.m. to take duffel bags of draft cards, but were unsuccessful in leaving with them. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, the thing about that action, it was actually a coordinated action where we had people from the Catholic left going into 3 draft board complexes at the same time, the same night in Philadelphia. And unfortunately, at one of the other ones than the one where we were, the night watchman found one of our people kind of hiding under a desk, waiting to eventually open the door for others. That led to police being called, and eventually the whole action was basically called off. So we're literally inside the draft board. We had managed to get in there, this group of 14 of us. We had gone in during the day, gone up to the top of a stairwell. It's like this 12-story office building. And we just stayed there for from the end of the workday until, 2 or 3 in the morning when we went down. So we had gotten in, and we were starting to put, the draft files in, the 1A draft files, the men liable to be drafted, most liable to be drafted, into bags. And we get this, somebody calls out. We didn't have cell phones back then, right? Somebody calls out from the phone in the office to find out that we should get out of there, because the cops were onto the fact that something was happening, and they maybe were going to be going to the other draft boards, was the reasoning. So from a practical standpoint, that action was kind of a bust, because we weren't able to really do anything with the files. But there was a second part of the action that had been planned, which was to go down to Washington, D.C. the very next night and go into the offices of General Electric. Their major corporate offices of General Electric, which was a producer of seeing eye bombs, the so-called smart bombs in Vietnam, which was a kind of a new technological development back then. And we were able to get into the building. We were able to get into the office of GE. went through their files, tried to find incriminating evidence, and frankly, we didn't find any. So from all those standpoints, it was an ineffective action. But we did a press conference a few days later, and we kind of announced that we had done this. We said we're taking responsibility for having done this.
This is called surfacing, right?
Called surfacing, right? That's what it was called within that Catholic left movement. And somewhat to our surprise, nothing happened. We weren't arrested. We got big press coverage. We had our pictures in the Washington Post with a major story underneath it. There was good press coverage. So that was my first action. I was in another action in Philadelphia. We actually went back to that same draft board I had gone into and successfully entered into it this time. Despite them putting up additional alarms, we figured out a way to get in anyway. We were able to get out all these 1A files, took them out, burned them. Next day, a big party, somebody's house west of Philadelphia.
This was only a few months after the first action.
It was 3 months afterwards. 3 months afterwards. Yeah, that people, again, the war drove us to do things we ordinarily would really never do. Right? That's what drove us. After that second Philadelphia successful action, we had a successful action where the Catholic left grouping, we organized actions in Wilmington, Delaware, at all of the draft boards. They're not that many. They're only 5 in total for Delaware. But we went into all 3 of the buildings where those draft boards were, and we did some effective disruption and so on. That happened. Nobody was arrested for that. Then the real big one for me was in Rochester, New York, where a couple of young women who were actually not really part of the Catholic left, but who liked these actions, they gave the leadership and organized what ended up being an action where we went into the offices of the Selective Service System. We went into the FBI office, went through their files, found a lot of incriminating files on all of the repression and surveillance that they were doing of black and Latino people, plus the women's movement and peace groups and so on. And we also went into the U.S. Attorney's Office as a protest against their role in the repression that was happening against lots of movements back then. So we were in there for 5 hours. We were about to come out, literally at the door, waiting for our rides to show up, when the cops came up to the door, looked in, saw us, and there's a whole story behind that. But we were arrested, had a trial several months later. We partly because we insisted on defending ourselves instead of just having a lawyer. 7 of the 8 of us defended ourselves, and we were able to bring into this 2-week trial lots of testimony about the war, how terrible it was, about FBI repression. We had Dan Berrigan, who was one of the Catholic priests who had helped to found the Catholic left. He was in prison at the time for an earlier draft board raid he had been part of in Maryland. He was brought in handcuffs to the court where we were having our trial. He gets up on the stand, and as part of his testimony, he's able to read the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and I think that went national. I mean, that was a big story, Berrigan, famous priest, in prison, testifies, reads the Sermon on the Mount in the courtroom. Anyway, the upshot of that 2-week trial is that we almost had a hung jury. I mean, actually, we did have a hung jury, and it was an open and shut case. We didn't say we didn't do it. We said this was the right thing to do, that the U.S. government was criminal. We were trying to stop their criminality. And the jury was hung 9-3 for conviction. And the judge, when he got a note from the jury asking if they could recommend leniency in sentencing, he wrote them back saying yes, and that unhung them. And we ended up getting convicted, but on every single count, the jury foreman said, with the recommendation of leniency. So, I mean, we fully, going into the trial, we fully expected, we were going to get 5 to 10 years in prison. It wasn't just a draft board. And it wasn't just the draft board and the FBI, it was also the U.S. Attorney's Office. We really, that's what we were prepared for. But because of a very successful political trial, because we got to the jury, because they were hung, I mean, even the ones who wanted to convict us, the stories that came out afterwards, they said they didn't want us to go to jail for very long. They had clearly been impacted, So we ended up getting sentences of from a year to a year and a half. And I ended up spending about 11 months in prison before I got indicted for something else. That's a whole other story.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You did a little time, I believe, at FCI Ashland.
Right, Ashland, Kentucky, a youth prison in Ashland. That's where I was first sent.
And then you eventually were able to get transferred to Danbury, right?
That was because I had been indicted on on April 30th of 1971. I had been indicted for a conspiracy to kidnap Henry Kissinger and blow up heating tunnels under Washington, D.C., with this supposed conspiracy that the government's manufactured was that draft board raids were planned as a lead-up to this action. Neither of those things were ever planned. Both of them, I learned after I was indicted, had been discussed, but they both had been rejected, primarily because the Catholic left was committed to nonviolent tactics, kind of militant nonviolence, and as far as the idea that was explored by a few people, not me, was to go into the tunnels under Washington, D.C., where there are these steam pipes, big steam pipes, in the winter, and to puncture the steam pipes, probably using explosives. And people realize that if that happened, there are homeless people who sleep on the grates in the winter, and people could die or be seriously injured. So that was scrapped. And there actually was a meeting where there was discussion of the idea of a nonviolent citizen's arrest of somebody like Henry Kissinger. It was talked about. At the same meeting, it was rejected. People said it's unrealistic. Who knows what could happen. Unfortunately, the government found out about that discussion. That ended up leading to this indictment of this supposed conspiracy. So I got myself moved from Ashland, Kentucky, to the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, so I could be with Phil and Dan Berrigan. That's where they both were. Phil was one of the other people indicted. There were 8 of us, and Phil was one of the other 8. Dan was there as he was an unindicted co-conspirator. And there were meetings that were happening regularly inside the prison of most of the defendants. People would come up every week, every 2 weeks, for planning meetings to get prepared for trial, because Phil was there in particular. So I got myself moved to be there. I ended up spending, I was in prison for a total of about 11 months, eventually got out. When I was in prison, I was on my first long hunger strike of 34 days, something that Phil organized. Yeah,
I was going to say in the book, I think you discuss at least 2 hunger strikes that you were a part of during that time.
That was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
That was one where we actually drank milk and juice and even some coffee, which really you shouldn't be doing on a hunger strike, but we didn't know. But the very next year, in 1972, I got out towards the end of 1971 after 11 months in jail and prison. And then in the spring of 1972, there was an escalation on the part of the U.S. government, the Nixon administration, of the Vietnam War. They mined the harbors in Hanoi and Haiphong to prevent, ships from coming in. There was talk about bombing dikes, so there'd be massive flooding. There was talk about using nuclear weapons, etc. It was getting really serious. So Dan Berrigan actually called a meeting. He was out of prison by this time, of a number of us, to talk about an idea he had of an open-ended fast, where we would fast maybe until we died. It was talked about like that's what was needed. So because I had done this fast the year before, I knew something about fasting, and I thought the idea was appropriate given how serious things were. So I and actually 13 others initially, we did, and this was a water-only fast. We took no nourishment, just water and a few vitamins and salt, basically. And it ended up going 40 days. There were 7 of us who lasted until the end of those 40 days. Maybe we had some impact. I mean, the war did end, actually. In terms of the U.S. role in the war, the U.S. Explicitly being involved on the ground. The air war actually continued for quite a while. But the U.S. being involved in on-the-ground military campaigns ended in January of 1973, just actually about 4 months after our fast ended. I don't think our fast was the reason. It may have contributed somewhat, but
it was at least a source of discussion in the community, right, and folks that were paying attention to these things.
Yeah, we got press coverage. NBC National News towards the end of it carried a story about us doing this. But it took literally 35 days before the national, in this case NBC, was willing to do something. I guess at that point they figured, well, I guess they must be pretty serious.
And then there was the one last action that was highlighted. There's the 1972 in March in York, where I believe you were part of the organizing in this one of the
yes.
the smart bombs coming back into the picture, right?
Yes.
Where they were sabotaged at the
Yes.
the American Machine and Foundry plant.
AMF, that's right. Yeah. What this was, this trial, there was the Harrisburg 8 trial, right? Was scheduled to start in March of 1972. And so several people, somebody had the idea, might have been Bill Davidon, actually, from Philadelphia. He was one of the leaders of the successful effort to go into the Media, Pennsylvania FBI office and actually remove the files and actually then be able to distribute them to the press, and it just blew the cover on what the FBI had been doing under J. Edgar Hoover with all these illegal and in some cases like murderous, literally, repression of particularly black and the Latino and the indigenous organizations, but not just those, but those in particular were most targeted. Racism again does its thing. So the trial of the Harrisburg 8 was to begin in March, and Bill Davidon, leader of the successful Media, Pennsylvania FBI action, and others of us started. Somebody had learned about this reality of these smart bombs. The casings, they were the metal casings for the smart bombs were being built at this AMF factory about 30 miles south of Harrisburg. And a number of people from the Catholic left had actually moved to Harrisburg to help to prepare for the trial and work in the community and leading up to the trial in March. And I was actually one of them. So, we spent a couple months in the middle of the winter kind of going down there, kind of watching from this hill overlooking. We were looking at railroad, rail cars, big open rail cars, where they put the bomb casings after they had been produced. My guess is there were at least a couple hundred bomb casings, maybe more per rail car. And what happened with them at a certain point, they were shipped to Philadelphia, where General Electric put in its electronic seeing eye thing into the very top of the bomb casing. And what we learned by looking into everything, going into the box cars and seeing what the situation was, there was like a rubber thing that was screwed onto the top, and it was very easy to just unscrew it. And that's again where they put the seeing eye, electronic eye. And so what people did when the the night of the action was to take a huge bolt cutter, a really big bolt cutter, a very powerful one, and they were able to to unscrew the rubber caps and use the bolt cutter to put a gash there in the threads, so that wasn't usable anymore. That was basically the sabotage action. It was nonviolent, right? There was never any risk of anybody getting hurt or killed except the people doing the action, right? But it was, it pushed the envelope. Some people might have felt, but again, this was 1972, and like it was still going, it was still going on, right? So again, that was my last action with the Catholic left.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of those nonviolent actions. It was very, from what I understand, a lot of these actions were very planned to make sure nobody was in the building. Right? If there was the possibility of confrontation, every single measure was taken to make sure that confrontation didn't happen. Right? For all these actions. Which is,
yeah, I think I'd want to say something here about the Weather Underground. That was another group, really, in terms of like the more predominantly kind of white peace movement. That was the other group which was doing militant actions, much stronger actions, and they were using bombs. They were setting off bombs, and we never, our group didn't like that idea. Partly because of the risk of somebody getting hurt or killed, but also politically in terms of reaching people. The thing that particularly attracted me to the Catholic left was first the nature of the actions they were doing, but also the fact that there were Catholic priests and nuns involved in giving leadership and being visible. That had a political impact that was very significant, right? I mean, I don't know how many Catholics there were back then, perhaps 50 million in the United States, and obviously that in terms of the impact, I think, politically of reaching many, many more people and not having people be turned off to the idea of bombing something because somebody could get hurt, right, etc. I felt then and continue to feel now that when you're talking about tactics, you really have to think strategically in terms of how your tactic is going to be able to be either used in a positive way to reach lots and lots more people, because they'll either understand it or they'll come to understand it over time, or vice versa, that even though it might fit with the urgency of the situation, just one person being hurt, right, can turn, the media can use that to paint, whoever it was that did this as violent, criminal, etc. I mean, we're seeing it under Trump, right? Seeing what they're doing, with some individual cases right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that night. You mentioned earlier about lessons learned, and that was definitely a lesson learned that I saw in practice, how basically militant nonviolence that was done with an explicit purpose of, in part, wanting to reach as many people as possible to help them understand the issues that we were taking action on. That's critical if we're going to ever be successful. Because we did win this one, Yeah. The Vietnamese, with their resistance over so many, like literally 3 decades from after World War II, 30 years they fought. First to expel the French colonialists, and then to expel the U.S. Colonialists and imperialists. That's what our government really was about. Getting into Vietnam, getting access to the resources, trying to keep communism from taking over, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say it does seem like the Catholic left did find that, I guess, like a sweet spot, right? It was able to effectively the Catholic left was able to effectively find the sweet spot between getting material action done and slowing down the war machine, but at the same time not alienating people to the movement. I think a big thing is it was in contradiction to what the war machine was, which was violence with the means of exploiting, while the Catholic left was nonviolent, and the only people they put in danger were themselves, right? Whether through the courts or physically,
right?
And
the other thing about these Catholic left actions is that they help to broaden out the amount of individual draft resistance that was being done by young men. Only men were being drafted back then. Young men being drafted to be sent to Vietnam. There's a dramatic escalation in the numbers of people who were not registering or who basically were not making themselves available, as well as people who explicitly were refusing to go, getting press coverage where they were. And there was an increase in the number of actions directed against draft boards, which might include things like throwing a brick through a window, which, that's not necessarily, to me, the greatest tactic. But there was a compilation that was done. I believe that there was over 1,000 actions of some kind that took place. So we were like inspiring other people in ways that, they took it upon themselves to determine, I guess, what they were going to be. So it really was the case that the whole selective service system was kind of like under siege, in a somewhat organized way through what we were doing and what the draft resistance groups were doing. There were lots and lots of draft resistance organizations led by young people, basically people of draft age. And I think we helped to strengthen their efforts, strengthen their work. So, it had ripple effects. It was an action that helped to broaden out. And when we had that Harrisburg trial in 1972, there were Vietnam veterans who showed up. There was a Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I think it might have been founded maybe even just the year before in 1971. Could have been 70, I'm not sure. But that was like a new development that Vietnam veterans were explicitly coming back home, speaking out, taking action, dramatizing that the war was wrong. People shouldn't go. People shouldn't be drafted, refuse to go. People should demonstrate. People should take action. So that was one of the nice things about that around the trial of the Harrisburg defendants. That they were there. There was like a delegation from Philadelphia, as I remember, of veterans wearing their army fatigues and everything, and that really helped in terms of the impact also to see that anti-war, basically pacifists or nonviolent actors. I'm not a pacifist, but I do believe in nonviolence and nonviolent tactics wherever it can happen, right? But to have that alliance with the returning Vietnam veterans and that we were like connected and working together, that was a powerful alliance.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, with any movement, like you brought up, there was groups like the Weather Underground, there was the Catholic Left, there were tons of different organizations. And unfortunately, whenever there are conflicts, movements movements rise up from that. And not everything's under the control, right? It's nothing's unified. It isn't a monoculture, but it is important to do something, right? And to set a precedent, set a example of how things should be done, right? And I think the Catholic left was definitely up there as one of the top movements in making sure that the war was stopped in the most efficient way possible. And so we could talk a bit, kind of go back to some of the, I guess, tactics. Briefly, we'll cover like the Catonsville 9, the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI of media. There were differences, right? Because some of these actions were hit and stay, and there was the utility of staying and saying we did this because we are against what's going on in Vietnam and the drafting of young people,
Right.
and making a statement, right?
Right.
There is a utility, but at the same time, there's that downside of, if you broke the law, even if you're on the right side, the law will get certain individuals until that tide shifts. And then there were actions, again, comparing the Catonsville 9, which was a hit and stay, and then you got the media
Right.
action, which was a hit and, I've heard hit and flee.
Don't get arrested, right?
Yeah.
No, that was a whole, again, an evolution that happened. The first action was actually in Baltimore in the fall of 1967, when 4 people, this was, again, Phil Berrigan who organized this, 4 people went into this Baltimore draft board, poured blood on files, and they waited. They just stayed there, waiting for the police and then for eventually press. And that was very deliberate, very conscious, because they wanted to explain why they did this. It was an action, again, trying to have an impact on people. But then Catonsville was really the big one. That was in May, I believe, of '68, and people went into the draft board, this town outside of Baltimore, took the 1A files of men about to be drafted or liable to be drafted and sent to Vietnam. Took them outside, poured homemade napalm on them, and then 9 of them, they formed a circle and they prayed and they sang, again waiting for the police to come and the press. And that continued. The next action was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, similar thing. Got all these files. That was one of the biggest. That one was significant because they were able to remove at least 10,000 files, individual files, and put them in a pile, burn them right outside in downtown Milwaukee. 14 people. But what happened? I guess might have been the next. I think it was the next year. Now we're talking about early 1970. I guess. Yeah. There was an action, might have in Boston, and people successfully did the action and got away. And the next day, they had a press conference to announce what they had done. And press came, and police came, FBI, and nobody was arrested after the press conference. And it was like, what happened? And people realized, I guess, that they didn't really know why it was happening, but people started thinking, if we can do the action, be really effective in terms of the numbers of draft records that we, destroy, and then we aren't arrested, we don't have to go through that process, we're able to keep organizing more actions, right? Maybe that's what we should do, and that's what it basically. So that's how it really evolved. In some ways, it wasn't so much a conscious thing at first. It was something that people started to realize, hey, maybe we should do it a little differently. So that's why I was able to do 5 actions, right? I mean, I was in the one in Philadelphia where we didn't stay around, the one that really was kind of busted. The second one in Philadelphia where we didn't stay around. Delaware, we didn't stay around. Rochester, we were staying around because we were arrested, but we weren't planning to. And then the casings, the bomb casings in York, Pennsylvania, where definitely people didn't stay around. Nobody has ever been arrested or charged for that action in York, Pennsylvania, for example. Yeah. So yeah, the one kind of the compromise, I guess, or the new tactic that evolved was to do an action and then to get people sign a statement saying that I take responsibility for this action, then to do a press conference and have a lot of them show up. So, like this Delaware action, we had a couple hundred people, who signed a statement saying, I take responsibility for these actions. So it showed that there was this growing breadth of support for what was being done. So, tactical flexibility, and kind of assessing things as they evolve is always like the way to go, really.
So, I mean, with the signing of those, of the stating that they did the action, right? Because I'm under the impression that these folks didn't do it, but in solidarity
Right.
they
It was
would.
in solidarity. It was basically a solidarity statement. Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then I guess it kind of makes it hard to try to find, like, if nobody came forward and then all these people come forward, but it's like not like logistically likely that 100 people took part. It does seem like a bit of a headache for the courts.
Yeah, well, it's like, it's one thing for the government, again, it's kind of somewhat related to the whole immigrant rights situation right now, right? I mean, if ICE goes somewhere and, it's just the one person or maybe the person with their family, and as we've seen, people can just get picked off. But if, people rally behind that person, either maybe when the thing is happening. There have been instances where ICE has come to pick somebody up, and neighbors, I think in Chicago maybe, neighbors like literally came out, and ICE ended up, leaving. They didn't do it. I mean, there's no question that people power can work, right, if it's done well, and, if you have a decent number of people. It kind of would vary from situation to situation what that means, right? But history does show that. Even under repressive governments, people power can absolutely work.
Most definitely. So if we could now move from actions to the trials, because I guess, for example, the Rochester trial that you went through, or the Camden 28 trial that happened here in Jersey.
Right.
Both of those, the defendants were able to bring the war to trial with a lot of the statements they made, the evidence they brought. In the case of the Camden 28, Howard Zinn showed up to discuss the Pentagon Papers and all this. So what is the I guess the most effective role of for those that do end up in those situations, right? That do end up, whether intentionally or not, to utilize the trials. Has that changed at all?
Yeah, I just thought of a couple recent examples of two different approaches. I was in West Virginia. I've been active in the climate justice movement for a long time, since 2003. And I was in West Virginia, where 12 mainly young people had been were on trial for several actions of militant nonviolence, where they had disrupted the construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, this huge frack gas pipeline. And their tactic was essentially have lawyers who were effective and find rationales as to why they really what they did was not that big a deal. They really shouldn't be punished very much. Eventually negotiating actually a settlement where there was a minimal fine and no jail time and even no probation, right? That was really very effective. So that allowed, those 12 people who were on trial, they could continue. I don't know what they're doing, but they could continue to be involved and do actions, right, if they wanted to do that. That's one example. But then there were people in the Midwest and the Northwest years ago. They went, there's the tar sands, in Alberta, right? This really, really very messy, oily, very destructive form of oil. That's one of the worst in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and people living close by when it's burned. So there's been a whole fight against, trying to prevent the tar sands extraction from continuing. So there were maybe 4 actions that this group, what were they called? The pipeline valve turners. That's it. They were valve turners. They identified these, small little fenced-in areas where there were valves controlling the flow of the oil coming from Canada down into the United States, along kind of the northern border of the United States. And they went in and they had figured out how to turn the valve so that the flow of oil, tar sands oil, into the United States was stopped. And I believe they actually notified the appropriate people within the company, maybe at the time that it was happening, or even maybe right before, so that they would know what was going on and be able to kind of do what was needed to prevent spillage, the pipe maybe breaking somewhere because of this blockage by turning the valve. So anyway, they went to trial. There were several different trials. I think pretty much in every case, their defense was that it was a necessity to do this because of the reality of climate change, climate disruption, global heating. And this dirty oil was really bad and really should not be being mined or transported. And they were successful. I think that maybe everybody was convicted. I'm not sure if anybody was acquitted, but it was a political trial. Most of the trials were political. And the juries, there might have been a jury actually that was hung, so there wasn't a conviction in that case. So so those are two different ways of doing it. I think you got to assess it situation by situation. I don't think there's one rule for necessarily the way to do it. Way back, and during the Catholic left, we had to do a political trial in Rochester, New York, because we had literally been caught inside, red-handed, with all those files cut up and the FBI files in bags. So we had no choice but to make it about why we did it, right? And we were effective. It turned out that it worked. And it was actually very similar then in Camden, where they had also been arrested while they had gotten into the building. The key thing with them was that there was a government agent who knew all about the action and was really integrally involved with it. And so that led to like 28 people being indicted because they had all this information. However, it's an interesting story, but eventually the government informant decided to switch sides because of the experiences he was having with the FBI. He was being, as he saw, disrespected and treated badly by the FBI. He felt they had lied to him about how things were going to go if people were arrested and so on. So he ended up testifying, and he explained that the FBI had known prior to the action, through him as the government informant. They had known that this was coming, that it was happening, and they allowed it to happen. They allowed people to actually go into the building, and then at that point they moved in and arrested people. And the jury, it was a jury trial, and the jury, because the judge allowed a lot of testimony, allowed him to testify, other people to testify about the war, how it was important to take action on the war. They were acquitted. Like 28 people were acquitted. That was a huge victory for the peace movement. That was in 1972. And again, the U.S. role in terms of on the ground military action, not the air war, that continued, but U.S. troops being used on the ground, that ended maybe 6 months after that trial in Camden. I think, again, it's not a direct correlation in any way, but that was a real sign that the people, and polls were showing it too, that masses and masses, big percentages of the American people wanted the war to end. It was very unpopular. So.
Gotcha. And so, after the Rochester action, again, you did about 11 months in prison, correct?
11 months, altogether.
So, a lot of folks might not be aware, but the action doesn't stop in prison. A lot of the action continued, organizing,
right?
Whether it's educating, doing
right.
classes, right? I believe you did a class with, your uncle, right?
Well, I was doing, it was as a way just to keep my mind, active. I had an uncle who was a teacher, college teacher, and I was able to set it up to have books sent in, and I would read them and do a little book report, and he would kind of write back and tell me what he thought about my book report. So I did that. But no, actually one of the most significant things that I experienced in prison along those lines was when I was transferred to Danbury, Connecticut. And I discovered that Phil and Dan Berrigan had organized they called it a Great Books reading group. And it met every Tuesday and every Thursday evening, like every week. And maybe 15 or 20 guys would come to these sessions. The one book I remember that we read was Sisterhood is Powerful, about feminism and the women's movement, which was just really beginning to develop. The latest phase of it at that point was beginning to develop then. In prison, I read Sisterhood is Powerful and discussed it with 15 or 20 guys. It was really kind of interesting. So that was 2 nights of the week, and then Phil, he organized for a smaller group of people who were in prison for draft resistance. We met Monday and Wednesday night, just 5 or 6 of us, because at Phil's pulling together, and we basically talked more about, Phil was kind of helping to keep our morale up, and we would discuss maybe things that were happening in the prison, things that were happening outside. It was kind of more, helping to, again, keep our minds sharp and our morale up. And because of that particular group, there was a point where in August of 71, where Phil took the initiative in organizing a hunger strike inside prison. It was after Phil and Dan had been turned down by the parole board, meaning they both were going to have to spend 3 more years, maybe more, in prison. And the way Phil explained it, he was very concerned that his brother wouldn't survive that. He actually was in the hospital, prison hospital. He had a heart attack, had come close to dying. Phil was very concerned. So he had this idea of doing a hunger strike after the rejection by the parole board of any possibility of them getting out before their full sentences. And being the good organizer he was, he proposed, and the rest of us definitely agreed. It couldn't be just about the Berrigans, because lots of prisoners, are treated unfairly or unjustly by parole boards. It's a big issue in prison how the parole boards function. Definitely was true at Danbury in 1971. So we added. So one demand was that basically Phil and Dan Berrigan, be released on parole within the next year or something like that. Then we had a set of specific reforms to the way the parole board functioned, one of which was that people, after they go up before the parole board and they're waiting for the decision, the decision comes back within a month, because sometimes it could go on for months and you're wondering what's happening. Another one was that people should have the right to see what's in their file that the parole board is looking at, so that they can respond to anything that might be, a lie or inaccurate, right? So anyway, so we had those as part of what we were calling for, and then there was a third one because we wanted to make continue to stay active around the issue of the war. We had a demand that some really terrible prisons called the tiger cages in Vietnam, really, really inhuman ways of holding people, that they be dismantled. That was an issue at that particular time. A congressperson from Tennessee had gone to Vietnam and had seen these tiger cages, and on humanitarian grounds he was very upset, and he spoke out about it. So anyway, so we had these 3 demands, and we there was somebody who was part of the Great Books discussion, that study group, who worked in the prison library where they had a mimeograph machine. So we were able, like in prison, to do up a leaflet, run off on a mimeograph machine inside prison, and on the morning where we started this hunger strike, we passed out leaflets to like the prisoners as people are waiting to head off to their prison jobs. And Yeah. So yeah, you can organize in prison. There's lots of examples of how that can be done. There's human beings in prison, right? I mean, you can talk to people, you can help people learn, right? So I learned that. I mean, and I also, for me, prison was in many ways very important because I had been raised in a very, very white middle class and working class. Those were the people who I basically grew up with. Very much, it was white people. It really was white people land. There was very, very few black or Latino or indigenous. It was so white. I mean, looking back on it, I mean, literally there were maybe 2 black people in my high school, maybe the whole time I was there. So, of course, it's very different in prison, just because of racism, of course. Many of the people in prison, very disproportionately, are black or Latino or indigenous. So I got to know people and, realize, hey, we're not really different, right? We have maybe different cultures, obviously different, melanin in our, bodies, all that, but underneath it, we're very much the same, and it was really helpful for me in terms of just growing in my understandings of kind of how I had been. Even though I was raised in a pretty liberal family where, we were taught to, basically from a Christian standpoint, to treat all people equally and decently, and I tried to do that. But it's different when you actually get to have the personal interactions and you realize, hey, we all deserve to be treated equally, and you understand racism. So it was very important for me from that standpoint to be spending a year in prison, almost a year.
Mm-hmm. And so, let's see. Well, I guess I kind of bring this up later, but I'm going to move to my quotes and questions section. So there's a couple of quotes that I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
That I highlighted that were pretty important. So I'll start with anger against injustice and oppression is not just legitimate. It is necessary to successfully build a movement for real change. But anger needs to be used in a disciplined way. And so we talked about this a little bit. I try to rephrase that as understanding that injustice and oppression exist, and that not enough is being done to resolve their existence can provoke anger and many other emotions in people. Some individuals reach this understanding and feel all these intense emotions, but don't know how or where to direct this energy effectively. So like an example you provide in the book is when people are like quick to call cops pigs, throw bricks, and acts such as these unnecessarily escalate tension without making advancements towards halting or stopping systems of oppression. There are poor utilization of energy. In contrast, actions such as the draft board raids that were able to destroy 10,000 draft cards at once, like the Milwaukee 14, could be done relatively politely, respectfully, while slowing down military recruitment. And so what conditions are not being met for individuals? Because I guess to add a little more context, contemporary context, we saw the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO.
Right.
And other actions that have happened recently like that. So what conditions are not being met for individuals that partook in these actions to reach the point that they did? Is it a lack of community, right? A lack of guidance as to how to effectively, counter systems of oppression?
Well, a mass movement for change on an issue, or for revolutionary change in society in general, is going to be composed of lots of people coming from different places. That's certainly my experience. It's hard for it to be uniformly very disciplined, in terms of the tactics that it uses. That's just reality. I do think any people, who are angry, who are pissed, who are emotionally distraught at so much of what's going on, it is really important to always be looking at the question, is what I do going to be able to be used basically by the enemy to discredit or distort what we're doing and why we're doing it? because major change doesn't happen through the actions of individuals or small groups of individuals. It happens through mass movements. In the United States, that means basically you need millions of people, at least, maybe tens of millions of people, to not necessarily be going out and demonstrating in the streets, but who are kind of with the movement, who where their thinking is, things that they say to family, co-workers, friends, that they're going to kind of defend what the movement is kind of calling for, right? You need that. You need it. I mean, especially these days with polling, right? Polling is, I think it's important to check out polls. You shouldn't be guided by polls. We should do what's right, whatever the polls say. But you still need to do a reality check. Well, where do people stand on, say, the particular issue or what it is I'm trying to change? And that's whether or not a growing percentage of people are coming around to see things our way. It's not like it's like the LGBTQ plus movement. When that started way back 50 years ago with the Stonewall uprising, right? In terms of the modern movement, and even 20 years later, if you did polling, I don't really know specifics, but I would guess maybe 25% of the population at the end of, say, by 1990 or so, maybe 25% supported, LGBTQ rights. I mean, actually, LGBTQ I don't think existed as a concept. It was lesbian and gay, right? And then it began to broaden out, kind of more inclusive of kind of, that aspect of people's lives. But over time, through all the organizing and the actions and the visibility that took place, people willing to stand up, people willing to take risks, that all changed, right? So that even as homophobic and heterosexist as the current Trump regime basically is, they can't be 100% anti-lesbian and gay people, right? They seem to be 100% against transgender people. They're using that as one of their foils, one of their ways to stay in power and confuse and divide people and build up hate and all the rest of what they do. But yeah, so I think that's really, to me, basic. You have to consider how are masses of people, how are large numbers of people who hear about this, who read about this, how are they going to react? If you know that many are going to react negatively, do you see that there are ways that over time, kind of education work can go on, articles can be written, videos can be done, social media can be used, whatever, to kind of help people get it on why it was necessary to do what was done and to keep taking action. That's really critical. And I think I've actually read people contrast that approach versus personal expression, right? That in some cases people do something mainly because they just want to express the way they feel without considering this other aspect of it, Yeah. And there is something. People should do the tactics that they feel personally that they're ready for, that they feel are fit with where they are, all that kind of stuff. What they think could be effective. But again, you always have whatever that is. You have to keep this other thing in mind, and it's not just expressing yourself, not just putting out how you see things alone. It's doing it in a way that builds a movement, a mass movement.
Gotcha. So the next quote here is, though there are a continuing series of risk-taking, non-violent direct actions around the country to try prevent. Though there are a continuing series of risk-taking, nonviolent direct actions around the country to try to prevent the building of oil and gas pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure,
right.
There's nothing resembling the ultra-resistance. I think a major reason for that is that there is nothing comparable to a forced military draft today. A draft affects millions of young people. It's a direct threat. It makes a faraway much more personally real. It provided focus for organizing masses of people, and many draft boards were relatively accessible targets. And so today there are many concerns regarding the ongoing genocide of Palestinian people, the climate crisis, and many other issues being exacerbated by the U.S. government. As noted in the aforementioned quote, there isn't a forced military draft today to light a fire under the masses of people in the U.S. to get involved, even though many of these issues do affect them. So funding for war is funding taken away from healthcare, affordable housing, public transportation, and other important infrastructure. It seems as though witnessing atrocities being carried out with our tax dollars isn't enough to snap some people out of a state of inaction. So there's a question of how to bridge that gap of proximity as a factor in animating those residing within the U.S. to get involved. Is there a way to mobilize our communities to a similar or greater degree as the 60s and 70s without a draft?
Well, actually, yes. I wrote this book, Burglar for Peace, the actual writing of it, the research and the writing of it, pretty much in 2016. I retired from my paying work in the climate movement in the fall of 2015. And then, one of the reasons I retired was because I did want to do more writing, and this Burglar for Peace was the first product of that. So that was like 8 or 9 years ago. And actually, in between, in terms of the climate movement, there have been changes. One is I mentioned about the valve turners. Those were some actions that happened that were similar to what we did in terms of draft boards. But very much in terms of mainly young people disrupting the efforts to build the Mountain Valley Pipeline. That's a really good example. As well as Standing Rock, what happened at Standing Rock, and masses of people actually, including people who did more aggressive actions as part of that, masses of people who were trying to prevent that pipeline from being completed. So that was towards the end of 2016 actually, when I was finishing my book. So there have been some changes from when I wrote that in terms of how younger people of this generation in ways that push the envelope, in ways that are risky, in ways that are nonviolent but are militant, right? So that's one thing. Same thing certainly in terms of the Free Palestine movement today, and there's lots of people getting arrested in mass actions. Right now there's a hunger strike going on. People are in the third week of a hunger strike at the United Nations against the genocide in Gaza. So I think there's been definitely, since I wrote this book, some positive developments. But another aspect, though, Trump's elected, as we're talking, maybe 7 months ago. And there's been all this resistance that's been happening, these massive demonstrations coordinated all around the country. That didn't happen during the Vietnam War. I mean, this is like a new tactic. That, as I understand it, starting on February 5th with 50-51, where they're from out of nowhere, 2 weeks after Trump takes office, in every state, there were actions that happened. Tens of thousands of people took part, kind of from out of nowhere, as I experienced it. This happens, and that helps to generate over and over and over again, so that the big one was hands-off demonstrations on April 5th, where there were 3.5 million people taking actions every state. Like, I think 1,200 actions happened, and there's one coming up as we're talking on June 14th. As of now, there's 1,400 places. That looks to be bigger than what happened, not just numerically in terms of places, but probably in terms of the turnout. Hopefully that'll be the case. So, and in terms of today, there's what happened with Bernie Sanders and AOC going on this, speaking tour out to primarily red states, red or maybe purple states out in the West, kind of the Rocky Mountains and so on. the Southwest, and huge numbers of people coming out, 25,000 to some of their events. So that, those things keep me going in terms of this fight that we're in right now against fascism, because there's no question that's what they want to impose. They want Trump fascism to be imposed. And people are rising up. People are standing up. They're refusing to buckle under, many people. And those hands-off actions, I think there were 200 organizations that were connected in with that. That's one of the reasons why it could be so massive and extensive. So there has been, I think, there are some good developments in what I would call a maturation of kind of our overall movement, where I think people get it, that we need each other. I think people definitely increasingly are getting it that and this, to me, this is very critical, that our culture has to be one that's not, infected with racism and sexism and heterosexism and ageism and leaders who are all into advancing themselves more than they are really building the movement. That we're all about building community, trying to be respectful of each other, even when we have major differences, right? That's when it gets hard, because it's easy then, people to get pissed, and the debate can get harsh, and that still happens. I'm not a Pollyanna about it, but my sense is that's changing, and that we're becoming a more mature movement, and we just really need to be. We can't defeat the Trump fascists unless we find ways to be together, stay together, keep being visible, keep applying that pressure. So I do have hope for the country because of that. I really do. As bad as things are, I do have hope that we can change things. I really do.
Mm-hmm. And so the next quote I have here is, and we talked about this a little bit. You say, "I agreed with the Weather Underground about the need to take stronger action to try and end the war. I agree with the sense of urgency,
right.
But I joined the Catholic left because they combined action commensurate to the urgency with a commitment to nonviolence and the building of a beloved community." And so one of the elements that made the Catholic left a formidable opponent to the war machine was its dedication to militant nonviolence. Nonviolent militancy made the movement palatable to the masses of Americans while still materially slowing down the operations of the selected services. Militant nonviolent disruptions of the war machine and all its subsidiaries is still a very effective strategy today. So what are some of the benefits for an organization to be explicitly nonviolent?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about that. This is the United States of America. That's the country we're operating in. And ever since 1788 was that the first actual election, might have been. I think the Constitution was ratified in 1787. So I think the first election for president and Congress was soon after that, 1788, maybe it was 1790, right? And that's been the way it's been ever since. In the United States, it's really deeply rooted that the way you have a different government is by electing that government. And despite all the different efforts periodically for basically from the right efforts to frustrate that. The biggest one is what we've got right now, of course, with the Trump and MAGA folks. That's really deeply rooted. So, if you're somebody's saying, well, the electoral system, it's just, it doesn't work, it's dominated by money, totally true. It's not proportional, it's winner take all, very much true, etc. But still, the concept that governments happen in the United States and change in the United States through the electoral process. So, that means that you don't change power using arms and guns and armed struggle in a country like this, where that's so deeply rooted again among the population as a whole. Doesn't mean that in an extreme situation, if these MAGA people take over, and I definitely am doing everything I can to prevent this from happening. But if we had full-out fascism, well, again, you got to look at a new situation and determine what you do. But I sure hope that we don't get to that. I don't think we will. I don't think that's likely. So nonviolent tactics, which include elections, which include direct action, which include just day-to-day organizing, like all of it, and building alternatives on local levels, food cooperatives, solar cooperatives, all these other ways of people working together to make a living, a decent living, without exploiting people. Get food and housing and so on. Build connections, strengthen yourself because you are part of a supportive community that's trying to operate out of love. It's not always easy to always do that, but if you try, it could happen. That I just feel is that's consistent with the reality of this country in general. Yes.
Gotcha. It actually kind of brings me to this next quote here. So people are looking to themselves and the institutions we've created, so food cooperatives, free health clinics, communes, alternative newspapers, etc.,
Right.
for the strength to press on. A revolutionary culture is developing, painfully and in starts and stops, which serves as both the new society within the shell of the old and the base from which to move out into the old society to organize. And so it's not enough to be in opposition against injustice and oppression, but we must be actively working towards building a better alternative. So we're seeking to replace, as we work to improve the conditions of our communities through building alternative infrastructure. We not only instill trust as organizations with our communities, but also set an example to be replicated by other communities. So one example that comes to mind actually is how the Heart of Camden, under the leadership of Michael Doyle of the Camden 28, one of the Camden 28 defendants, was able to rehab and sell more than 250 homes to low and moderate income families in the waterfront South neighborhood in Camden, New Jersey. Doyle was also a driving force behind the opening of the Nick Virgilio Writer's House, the Camden Shipyard and Maritime Museum, and the Camden Fireworks Art Studio, as well as a community gym and field house, which now carries his name. So over the years,
Wow.
have you noticed a change in barriers or difficulty to building this new society within the old?
Yeah, I didn't realize all of that about Michael Doyle. Yeah, he was a special person, this Catholic priest. Yeah, yeah, that's a great example. I mean, those are things that are tangible for people, right? They're very tangible, and if they're not just providing jobs, incomes, food, whatever, but they're also culturally different, right? That's again so key. If they are, more or less trying to, work together and help everybody grow and, achieve what they can achieve, all those things. There's staying power, right? There's staying power to that. If all you're doing is just constantly doing actions, and there's not something to sustain you, when you need a break, when your actions are over, etc. This is a long haul, right? This is a long haul. There's a book by a Miles Horton. Actually, it's a wonderful book, an excellent book by Miles Horton. He was the leader of this not remembering the name, this place in Tennessee, this kind of a place where people were kind of trained and learned how to be good organizers. Highlander Center, that's it, the Highlander Center in Tennessee. They've been around since the 30s, and he was the director for a long time. Miles Horton wrote this book. I believe The Long Haul is part of the name. And it's really an excellent book, kind of to show, a lot of what we've been talking about, kind of this mix of activism, cultural, a different kind of a culture, and building these, alternatives that can help people kind of get through their lives on a day-to-day basis in a better way.
Gotcha. And so, so the next quote I have here is, how can organizations or movements structure themselves so that they stay true to their best instincts and model the new world that must be brought into being? So one example can be found in the group Beyond Extreme Energy, in what we call our organizational principles and practices, bylaws of sorts. So forming an organization can consolidate the endeavors of a movement by pulling together resources, concentrating effort towards specific objectives. What advice would you give to people that would like to get organized?
You know, if you look at the history of revolutions, going back, let's say to the Russian Revolution in 1917 and since, it's an historical fact that usually revolutions happen, people are, genuinely trying to make a better society, and things don't go so well, right? There's actual corruption of people who are in leadership. And we need to learn from that, right? We need to learn from that. And I do think the women's movement that I haven't talked about at all here yet. The women's movement is extremely important in terms of this piece of it. The fact that women are more than half of the world's population, that's important. The fact that, in general, my experience, women are more cooperative in just the way they interact with one another, less competitive, less aggressive, trying to get ahead, all that kind of stuff. That, in a patriarchal culture, it's kind of set up that way, right? That's the men's role, to go out there and make the money and get ahead and get rich and all that. And generally, not in every case, there's certainly a fair number of women who are affected by that themselves, but in general, women are much more attuned to the need to grow together, to interact in a way that's much healthier. So to the extent to which women are in leadership of our organizations, in significant numbers, I think to that extent are the chances of us succeeding in general, but also succeeding in this very important component of having a culture that is about you respecting one another, basically based on love, cooperative, etc. I think that's very key. It's not just the women's movement. It certainly comes from indigenous cultures, Black and African, Mexican, Latino cultures. There's macho, right, in those cultures, but there is also, at the same time, again, less of the kind of really the capitalistic, individualistic, get ahead at all costs, look out for number one, that whole cultural dynamic. So yeah, we need to be, conscious of those things and consciously work to build that into the movements that we're developing and the organizations we're building.
So I guess kind of a follow-up question here. What advice would you give to people that are trying to start an organization where they might not find one near them to join?
Well, you got to figure out what are the issues or issue you want to focus on, right? If there is something you're really concerned about, could be some local thing happening in your community, that some project, some big huge corporation wanting to build something. Like actually right last night, I went to a Nutley, town next door to me, and this big turnout of like 150 people because there's a effort underway on the part of Amazon to build a huge warehouse in a neighborhood, not in an industrial area, in a neighborhood. And some of the information people were able to gather was they were talking about like 40 truck bays, 40 places for trucks to park, constantly coming and going, and like 16 hours a day and night, right? So there's a lot of opposition to it, and I went to that last night. So that's an example, right, of something that somebody might, learns about this, and they say, hey, I don't want this in my town. This is not what we need, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you need to join with other people. You can't just do it by yourself. And you don't need to have big numbers at first. I mean, you can start an organization with 2 people. If both of the people know how to work together, are willing to do work in between, are willing to talk about, well, what do we need to do? What are the next steps? Kind of think strategically. And clearly, if you're just starting with 2 people, you need to talk about, well, how do we get more people, right? Because you have to have a core group bigger than that. But you can have a core group of 3 or 4 people even, as long as you're, not closed off and you're open to expanding it, or you're looking to expand it, and then you have a broader, membership, etc. I think it's not a mysterious thing, building an organization. A lot of it is being clear about what it is you're focused on, doing the research, right, so that you're knowledgeable about the issue, so you can speak to people with your point of view on it. And then building, as you get more people involved and more people respond, building a way for everybody to participate in the decision making, to have a truly democratic process. I think those are really a lot of the basics. It's not rocket science. It's really not.
Seems like the hardest part is starting.
Starting. That's right. That's the hardest part. Getting started. Yes.
So this is actually my last quote here, and it is beyond doubt that the actions of the government in bringing the Harrisburg indictments led to changes for the worse within the action community, beginning with the severity of the original charges of the Harrisburg charges. Under the indictment, people convicted would have been subjected to life in prison, but probably more significant were the things revealed by the indictment, and most particularly the smuggled letters between Phil and Liz. These revelations did not engender confidence and trust. They did engender fear and hesitation, which without a question was one of the government's main objectives. So the discovery of COINTELPRO, subsequent leaks from whistleblowers having uncovered illegal government activity over the years, surveillance and infiltration were utilized to instill distrust and ultimately division within any organization considered to be in opposition to the U.S. government's interests. So how do we best protect our movements and organizations from these tactics of infiltration and all that?
Well, somebody once said something to the effect that if you suspect that somebody has infiltrated your group, put them to work, which is an interesting way to think of it. One thing, if you do have somebody that you think maybe you're not trustworthy, I mean, you obviously should try to do some research. It's a lot easier these days with the internet to look into somebody's background, etc. And it's obviously important to get to know the person on a personal level and talk with them, etc. But if all of that leads to your not being sure, rather than having maybe a big divisive kind of a split, right, in which this person may use your trying to say get them to leave as a way to divide the group. That's their whole purpose, right? That's what they're trying to do, divide the group. Well, so you put them to work. So you say, well, you go do this, you go, etc. So number one, I'm basically saying accept that this is something that likely could happen. Another thing is, again, this key issue of a culture, of having a culture that is about being cooperative, about not letting individual people, and usually it's men, particularly white men, who are very much, talking a lot and want to control things and, be the spokesperson all the time and so on. But if you have a much more cooperative culture where people share the leadership, some people have skills, and so you take advantage of that, work with that. But you have a culture where people are really trying to help one another grow as human beings, as well as taking action on the issues, etc. It's hard for, it's not that it can't happen. There are some really skillful people, no question about it. But it's much harder then for an infiltrator or a government agent to do their damage. Yeah, I think those are the main things.
I was gonna say, if you're lucky enough, it seems like you could even get them to turn.
You can.
Like,
That has happened. Well,
like in
that's
Camden.
exactly what happened in Camden. There you go. Yeah, this guy was right in there, and he turned, and it became a big victory for the movement when the jury unanimously acquitted all these people who were inside the draft boards. You know, it was no question what they wanted to do. But because of mainly this guy turning, but also because of the sentiment in the country changing in terms of the war, that happened. So yeah.
And so, to kind of get a little more specific with that quote, regarding that conflict with you and the others Harrisburg defendants, has hindsight provided you with any mistakes that were made by any of the parties involved, things that could have been done better, whether it was like a lack of communication or solidarity when it came to the action, you know?
Well, again, things like that can happen. Actually, I didn't mention this, but in terms of this Rochester, New York action, where I got arrested and eventually went to prison for, there was an informant who knew about our action, and I actually talked to him 3 days before the action on the phone. He wanted to talk to me. I got word he wanted to talk to me. I didn't know him well at all, but I had met him, and so I talked to him. And it turned out that the government knew about what we were planning to do. They didn't have too many details, but they knew when we were doing it. And fortunately, the way we did the action, our tactics, some luck was involved. We were able to get everybody inside, and for 5 hours we did our damage there inside the building, and we thought we were actually going to be able to get away, even though when we were in the building we noticed cops periodically coming up and checking the doors. We knew that they thought something was happening, but they never came inside, so they didn't know we were there, and we were shielded in terms of where we were. They couldn't really see us. So again, those things can happen. Honestly, people are human and make mistakes, and in this very specific case about the Harrisburg 8 case, and this guy working for the government who ended up being trusted by Phil Berrigan. Phil Berrigan's in prison. He trusts this guy who turns out to be a government informer, and Phil trusts this guy who is on work release. He's on work release, leaving the prison every day to go to work in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. It was Lewisburg Federal Prison, and Phil trusted him to carry letters to then be sent to this nun, Elizabeth McAllister, as a separate communications channel, and that's where they were talking about this idea of a citizen's arrest of Henry Kissinger, and this idea of puncturing pipes under Washington D.C., etc. I don't know. Phil Berrigan, who without him none of this would have happened. He just made a big mistake. He never should have trusted this guy. In hindsight, there's no question about that he shouldn't have done it. Those things happen. Those things happen, and you do your best you can to kind of clean things up afterwards and try to keep moving. I mean, the Catholic left, after that trial, where these letters kind of were introduced in evidence, and this informer testified. This is again April of 1972 into May. I'm talking about. The Catholic left pretty much. I don't know if I'd say that it died, but there wasn't much happening anymore. And I know that part of it was these feelings were kind of raw about some of this on the part of people, some people. And there were real tensions and conflicts. But there was, a gathering that happened in 1973 that I helped to organize of about 50 or 60 of us from the Catholic left. And again, this was when it was clear that the war was winding down. There had been peace agreements signed in January of 1973 between the U.S. government and the Vietnamese government, what was called North Vietnam, at the time. And it was clear that things were moving towards, eventually the U.S. being forced out completely. So that was part of it too. But at that meeting of these 50 or 60 Catholic left folks, there was a lot of very open discussion over the course of a weekend. We consciously decided we weren't going to try to continue as a network or as an organization. People were doing different kinds of things. Life moves on, and you kind of have to adjust and try to just, do your best to stay on top of it, to understand it, be clear on what can and can't be done as best as you can, both individually and then more generally in terms of organizations and movements. I mean, that's happened with me when there's been times in my life when I've decided, well, I need to take a shift. I've been doing this for a while. That's natural. And it's also true for groups. For movements, I guess you'd say for a movement that's about kind of really fundamental, revolutionary change in the world, because the world needs it. That has to continue. But again, movements, things can grow and change within the context of a generalized movement, moving towards something new and different. And things can't be static. Things do change. That's the reality of life. Things do change, and we need to try to have them change for the better, doing the best we can.
Gotcha. And so we'll start wrapping it up, Ted. So what contemporary struggles do you believe to be I put down most important, but are in your field of view, I guess, the more important that you're focusing on right now?
Well, it's an easy one for me to answer, in that since 2003, I very consciously have been working on the climate crisis. Because it's very clear that unless there's just a dramatic turnaround, unless we get off of, unless we break the power of the fossil fuel industry, that's the basic issue. The fossil fuel industry continues to have, particularly in the United States, as well as other places. It's not so true in a lot of the world, but definitely in the United States, it's a big problem that the power of the fossil fuel industry to control what the government does, it makes it very difficult to make the needed shift away from oil and coal and gas and nuclear to wind and solar and water, flowing water, rivers, streams, tides, etc., waves, as well as geothermal, kind of tapping into the kind of constant, relatively constant 55-degree temperature of the Earth for both heating in the winter as well as cooling in the summer, right? That's very, over time, I think, going to become an important technology. I mean, that has to happen, that absolutely has to happen. It is happening worldwide, that renewable energy, there's more money now being invested worldwide in renewable energy than fossil fuels by a significant amount. I think might be close to 60% to 40%, and that's up from whatever it was. Say 10 years ago, it might have been 20% renewables and 80% fossil fuels. That's not necessarily accurate, but it was something like that. And now there's no question the world is shifting away, and that's a very positive thing. The U.S. is definitely, Saudi Arabia, Russia, those are countries that are not doing what they should be doing at all in terms of the shift. But we have to keep up the fight. Because I'm in the ecosystems and human societies everywhere in the world are at risk, and we're seeing it with the floods, the droughts, the storms, the smoke, we're getting now coming down from Canada, the fires, everything is escalating in intensity and how destructive they are. And scientists who have been studying this for 30 or more years are very clear that we're cooked. The planet, our humans. One of the things that hasn't yet happened too much, certainly not in the United States, maybe actually in some places like kind of Northeast Africa and the Middle East, the dry conditions, the drought conditions that have gotten worse, over, this period of global heating, the heating up of the atmosphere. A lot of the wars that have, like in Syria, I think the Syrian, civil war that went on was partly a result of really severe drought, just damaging the human societies there, human communities, making it much harder for people to survive, for farmers to produce their crops, etc. When you're talking about really the existence of life forms, human life forms, of human societies being able to continue, much less become better, right, the way we've been talking about, that's the reality of what the climate crisis is about. It's kind of like nuclear war, right? Nuclear war would happen kind of quickly if it ever happened, right? If a big nuclear war happened to kind of just decimate human societies and ecosystems. But so far, ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's been 80 years, and, no nuclear weapons have been dropped. So there's some hope, I guess, for the human race that way. And I mean that genuinely, right? That's something, right, that the human race has been able to, keep from happening so far. But it's inexorable, the whole process of the breakdown of ecosystems, and as a result, human societies, because of the climate crisis. It's happening, and it's continuing to happen, and it's getting worse. So for me, that's why since 2003, that's the issue that I focus on. But there's obviously so many others. Clearly right now, Gaza and Palestine, just the genocide that's taking place. Every Friday, unless I'm sick or out of town or something, I go to a weekly demonstration in the town, one town over from me, around Gaza. Work with a group called New Jersey Peace Action, and that's the main group that organizes those actions. That's really huge. Just fascism, the threat to democracy, and the Trump and MAGA, that right now in the United States, and even beyond the United States in terms of the impacts of the U.S., that's clearly huge. That's why this, at root, really a pro-democracy movement that's sprung into action ever since Trump took office, starting on February 5th with those 50-51 actions. And still continuing as we're talking, right? There's going to be big actions in about a week and a half on July 14th all over the country. That's really, really important, that pro-democracy movement that links to many other aspects of that, right? I'd say those right now, for me personally, is what I would see as most important.
I was going to say, you can almost think of the communities being displaced by climate change, climate catastrophe, or kind of being drafted in to kind of similar to how folks were drafted into the Vietnam War, right? And hopefully it doesn't get to that point for people to take action, to be directly affected by what's going on with the planet and the fossil fuel industry. So what final words of advice can you offer to folks that would like to get more involved in the struggle for a better world?
Well, I guess, people can go to my website if they want to see more of what I'm talking about. I do write a column, Future Hope column. I've been writing it since 2000. At first it was every 2 weeks, and really ever since the rise of kind of Trump 2 in last year, it's now a weekly column that I write that gets posted here and there, and I send out. So that's one. So it's just my name, tedglick.com. So if people want to learn more about my thoughts, you can go there, and there's other information about what I do. I do encourage people who are maybe somewhere where there's no real organization that they like or feel is what they feel they need, or is focused on the issues that they think should be focused on. You can start a group. You can, and don't be overwhelmed. I think one of my columns, I know one of my columns actually is like a little kind of short little fact sheet based on my experiences, and I think it's called how to build a successful organization. So it's in there in this long list of columns going back to 2000. So I think that's important, and I guess the last thing I'd say, I write the name that I gave to these columns when I started writing them was Future Hope. I guess I certainly believed back then, and I certainly believe it now. We do need to look for hope. It's so easy to just feel beaten down, especially now under these Trump fascists. Feel beaten down and kind of hopeless in the climate crisis. I mean, what's going to happen to the world? All these things. Black people in the South, under slavery and then, Jim Crow segregation and all the rest of it, the conditions that they had to operate under were so much worse on a day-to-day basis than what many of us today experience. The internet didn't exist, right? We have this instant communications all over the world. Cell phone, all these things, right? We have these tools that people didn't have, and there's grounds for hope. We're sitting out here in my backyard. Just the life forms, the other life forms that we're part of on this planet. There's miraculous stuff, really, when it comes to creation. There really is. And I think there are grounds for hope that we may be able to make it. We may come to the other side of this. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. In terms of really the significant changes needed away from kind of monopoly, corporate, capitalist, racist, sexist, that whole dynamic that we have, those kind of societies. That's going to take a long time, but I do think we maybe sooner than we think could see this. Let me end with this. In terms of hope, in 2015 and 2016, Bernie Sanders ran for president as an open socialist who was elected as an independent, not as a Democrat, in Vermont, and had been re-elected many times. He goes out, he starts traveling the country, gets these massive rallies, right? Massive rallies, thousands, tens of thousands of people start coming out. 15 million people end up voting for him, right? That was a revelation about changes that had happened in this society, in the United States up until that time. Who would ever have thought? I wouldn't have thought, I don't think, that Bernie, that an independent socialist, explicitly willing to talk about that, could get 15 million votes and almost get the Democratic Party nomination. And the polls were showing, speaking of polls, I was following this. Every day I would check these. The polls were saying that it was like Hillary Clinton if she won versus Trump, right? And the polls were showing that she would be ahead maybe 5 to 7 points, right? Something like that for a lot of the months leading up to eventually Hillary getting the nomination. Like, early 2016, I guess it would have been. Bernie was like 12% to 15% better than Trump. Polls were showing that he, may well have really beaten Trump pretty decisively, but he couldn't get it over. We couldn't get it over the finish line. So again, and here's Bernie and AOC, earlier this year, 2 months ago, going out there to red states in the West that went for Trump, bringing out 25,000 people to events. So there's definitely hope. There's absolutely hope.
So I'll end it with an excerpt from Chapter 8, Fast Unto Death. In this chapter, you share excerpts from a journal that you wrote in during the Fast for Life action, where you and 13 others took part of a water-only fast that was to last for a minimum of 40 days. And the following is a portion from your August 15, 1972 journal entry. I am a revolutionary because it is the best way to live, and because we must all struggle against the deaths of others, the needless, cruel deaths of others, in order to be true to our own lives and our own responsibilities as human beings. At times that has to mean risking one's own life for the greater good. Such is the nature of things. So thank you, Ted, for taking this time to interview.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest and willingness to do this. Thank you.